Qualys has brought together vulnerability management and patch management, letting security teams discover vulnerabilities and apply patches immediately, all within a single, unified app. Sign up for a free trial of Qualys VMDR, vulnerability management, detection, and response today at securityweekly.com/Qualys. Welcome back, everyone, to Black Hat 2021, live with Security Weekly from G Unit Studios here in Rhode Island. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian. Joining me for this micro interview is Sonali Shah, Chief Product Officer at Invicti Security. Welcome, Sonali.
Hey, Paul. Thanks for having me.
It's nice to have you today, and we're talking about shifting left, which, as you believe, and I'm going to be honest, I agree with you, can leave you vulnerable. So I guess first, Sonali, when we say shifting left, I think that means a lot of different things to a lot of people. What do we mean when we say in security shifting left?
Yeah, you know, it's the concept of securing your applications earlier in the software development cycle. So as early as in the IDE, almost having like spell checkers find vulnerabilities in code, and starting as early as possible, because the reality is the earlier, the faster you find the vulnerability, the cheaper and easier it is to fix.
Do you think that also plays into the design and kind of architecture phases as well? Or is
actually, that's a really good point. In fact, I would take it even further left and say that in colleges or in schools where they're teaching software development, they should be teaching how you secure, how you write secure code. So if I had it my way, I'd shift all the way left to where the developers are taught to code to begin with.
I feel like it's a nice game plan and it works out some of the time, but you can take the sports analogy, like you've got this game plan that you put together, like here's how we're going to do things. But then when you get into the thick of things, you don't always follow the game plan. And I feel like that happens in software development too.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think, if you think about sort of the history of application security, right? Generally, people would start in the middle, maybe a DAS scan just before releasing, and then manual penetration testing, once a year. They tried, a lot of enterprises tried to secure more apps, but at the time, the technologies weren't there, right? It was too slow, too many false positives, not integrated in the DevOps tool chain. And then a couple of years ago, you had this huge sort of swing on shifting left, and tools like SaaS that were, faster, a little bit better integrated, still a lot of false positives. But in theory, this concept of finding and fixing early makes perfect sense, right? Mm-hmm. In reality, I think it doesn't work for a couple of reasons. First of all, you're ignoring everything on the right. So most companies have thousands of apps out there that they're not actively developing, right? And so you're missing those with the shift left. The other thing is, if you think about, and this as a developer, the developer's primary focus is to get code out quickly that does what it's supposed to do, right? Mm-hmm. So the functionality is really important. Security is just something that slows it down, right? And so there's just this pressure to release really quickly. So that makes the whole shift left difficult. There's also still generally a lot of false positives, not enough qualified staff. I was just talking about developers not learning about security, and not enough security tools folks out there. As we all know, it takes forever to hire security folks these days. Not enough security folks to really help out the developers resolve the problems. So for all of these reasons, definitely I would recommend everybody shift left and do, security early in the dev cycle, but don't forget about the right and the majority of your apps that are not in live development or are third-party apps that you don't even own the code to, right? You need then to be able to scan those as well.
Yeah, it's interesting also when you identify a bug that it could be a vulnerability in software, it's difficult to determine in that phase when we're on the left if that can really be exploited or not. And I think that's the advantage you have with scanning is because I exploited it, right? But as a developer, I'd look at the recommendations from my IDE and it would go, this is vulnerable, or using a vulnerable library. I'm like, but I never call the method
Right.
that was vulnerable. And yeah, I'm using that library, but it was only that one method in that library that was vulnerable, and I never call that one. And
Right.
tools sometimes have a difficult time figuring that out.
Yeah. No, absolutely. One of the things that actually a lot of the tools, of course, our tool in particular, but a lot of tools have gotten really better at is, it's still an issue, but gotten better at the false positives. One of the things that we did very early on is this concept of proof-based scanning. So we're actually showing you that this is exploitable. And you can do that with DAST, you can do that with IAST, with a lot of the SEA tools now in the market as well. You can tell if that vulnerability is actually exploitable. So we are getting better, but your point is still very much the case.
Yeah, and the priority is often interesting aspect when you look at in your IDE. It would give me like this huge list of issues, right? It was like a little button, like go check, and then it would check all of these things, and not just for security, but like for good coding practices, and it would prioritize them. And it's overwhelming as a developer to look at those. And then oftentimes, like, you look at some of the medium ones, and you're like, that's really not an issue. But a medium level vulnerability in a priority severity sense from a scanner, that's something that I want to go fix, versus when it could be sitting in the code.
Right. Absolutely. It's tough to be a developer these days. There's a lot of pressure to innovate quickly, build the right thing. It should function as expected, but then also needs to be secured, right? You don't want to be that developer that put your company on the front page of the New York Times.
Yeah. It's really hard to, because like you said, I think developers are prioritizing functionality, and that's hard enough. And having the time to go through and remediate vulnerabilities, which you're also kind of unsure at that point, is like, am I remediating the right vulnerabilities? So what on the kind of scanning side, what do you do to help with the prioritization, kind of above and beyond exploitation? Is there like a process, or how are you prioritizing?
Yeah. So, I think just first of all, accuracy is hugely important, right? So that when we find something, and for 95% of high severity vulnerabilities, we are able to provide the proof. So when we provide proof, customers know, all right, absolutely, you've got to fix this, right? So we allow customers to say, all right, if it's a high or medium severity vulnerability, Invicti's is giving you the proof of exploit, immediately open a JIRA ticket and make sure the developer takes care of it, right? And if it's a really high severity vulnerability, and if it's an application that has access to sensitive information, or it's taking credit card information, right, then don't even let it be released. So I think that plays a really big part. One of the things we're looking at doing also is bringing in this concept of true risk, right? And you talked about that. Will it actually be exploited? And I think so. Some of the things we're looking at leveraging, obviously years of scan data, machine learning, things like that, is understanding the context of the application. So looking at the severity, all right, it's high severity vulnerability, but if it's on a page that doesn't have access to sensitive information, maybe it's not so important to stop the release, right? So accuracy is one part of it, but the other layer that we are starting now to work on is how do you also bring in this concept of exploitability and the importance of the asset, right? Does anyone actually care about breaching it? And I think that'll bring another layer of prioritization. Does that make sense?
No, it certainly does, especially when you look at cross-site scripting as an example, which I think for a long time, and there's still tools out there today that kind of treat cross-site scripting as a certain severity type. But as you and I and many know, that could really not be an issue, right? Or there's other limiting factors in how do you take that into account in your process, because you don't want all your developers fixing every instance of cross-site scripting equally, when that one may require that you're logged in with a certain privilege level in order to access that. I saw that when I was like, there's a cross-site scripting here. I'm like, yeah, but I got to be logged in as admin in order to even run the exploit, against it. And, who has control of that data over which point, I think greatly affects the severity of something like a cross-site scripting.
Exactly. And understanding that context, right? So I think the way, and it's any type of risk, whether it's financial risk or cybersecurity risk, understanding the concept or the context of the risk is so important, right? Like if you're buying life insurance, right? You're looking at the age of the person. Do they have kids? Do they have, heart conditions? Like, so all of these things that are around the context of where the application is, the context of how the vulnerability would be exploited, all of that needs to come into play so that you are really prioritizing true risk and you're not just trying to just fix everything.
Right. Does that come in with other, vulnerability types? So, like, I guess, do you pull in data from, like, recently I was reading the CWE, common weaknesses and exposures, right? And there's one for web vulnerabilities as well that kind of go through each of the types. And, like, do you take that into account from external sources as well?
Yes, we do. It's really important that we look at, we've got external sources we're looking at, and then we've got our own, because we offer both on-prem and cloud. We've get a lot of data just from scanning thousands of times a day, right? That we're also able to use.
And do you crowdsource some of that? Like, do you get one that, in this certain scenario, people have kind of marked this as a lower priority versus the one that maybe comes out of the box? So are you able to crowdsource some of that data?
We are, because our customers are integrated with us completely, right? So we've got some customers who aren't integrated at all, but we've got a lot of customers who are integrating us. So we see, we know when the build occurs, a scan is kicked off, right? We see when tickets are open. We see when they're closed. We see when someone is changing the severity of it, right? So we just have all of this data about how customers are what they're doing with the scan results, and we're able to use that to continuously make our engine better.
Yeah, that's awesome. There's so many different web frameworks out there, languages, all of that plays into the severity. How do you take that into account, given that we talk about cross-site scripting as an example, but that presents itself differently based on how the application is put together, what language they're using, frameworks, protocols, all that stuff. You have to take that all into consideration, correct?
I think that's, one of the things that we're really starting to focus on is we've got years of data that tell us sort of what is really exploitable, right? Where are the, looking at the framework, the language, right? What are the things that really should be prioritized? And so of course we've got our own, security research team looking at a lot of these things, but then we've also got a data science team looking at how do we make sense of all of this data to make our recommendations much more accurate and more importantly, actionable, so you know what to do with it.
Yeah. Do you find that some of it is code and some of it is configuration? You balance the two, correct?
Yes, absolutely. And there's a lot you can observe from outside, as you well know, without breaking into anybody's network, just to see how they're configuring things and have they configured them properly, right?
Right. Yeah, the web server certainly comes into play when we talk about redirect attacks and things like that. And that's like, maybe do the developers even have control of that? It depends on the environment.
Right. Yeah. And I think, one of the things with security is we've been really kind of siloed, right? So a lot of point solutions, whether it's, within AppSec, you've got SAST, DAST, IAST, you've got network vulnerability management, you've got WAFs. And I think, like, when I think of what is the next generation of AppSec, I think it's going to be a world where it is an alphabet soup. It is actually tying in all of these various, I would say, various testing engines and the context of that particular customer to produce much more meaningful results. I think that's really where the industry needs to go to really, really help customers secure. I feel like right now we're just spending a lot of money on all these different tools, but because we're not looking at everything together and tying it into the real live context, we're, as an industry, just producing a whole lot of alerts that are really difficult for our customers to prioritize.
Well, at what point in the development process do you recommend people do scanning? And I know it's a difficult question to answer because people have different, ways of chaining all that stuff together, right? Like, do you do it when, like, the developer make a build and then it gets scanned, or does it go to QA? Does QA even really exist today, right? Does it go up to staging, right? Do you wait till it's in production? Probably not. Maybe. I don't, like, where in the stages do you do this testing?
I think, look, if you follow sort of what people are saying about shift left, then doing it as early as possible, it makes sense to the extent that if it's a real vulnerability, it's cheapest, right? Fastest and cheapest to fix it there. I think that, with the CI/CD, what makes sense doing it there is with the combination of DAST and IAST, you're able to see sort of outside in, inside out, and really be able to identify with accuracy that things are exploitable. And so we recommend starting there because it gives you results that developers can trust. What happens, we see, is when you start really early on, you've got all these inaccuracies, you start losing the trust of the teams. And that's a really big issue, because once you've lost the trust, developers are thinking, all right, why should I believe these guys, right? Last 2 times I tried it, turned out to be false positives. I wasted all this time. So I think with the testing tools that we have today, kind of in the CI/CD pipeline, I think is the place where you can really get enough good information to identify the vulnerabilities and identify them accurately. But you can't stop there, right? There's so many applications that either you haven't developed in-house, or you're not actively developing, even if you do own the code. So I think you need to, it's got to be continuous, right? It's got to be continuous. And I was really surprised, recently heard a very large bank scanning almost daily, right? Which in the past was sort of unheard with DAST and of course now IAS is there as well. Before it was like once a year, but we've got people doing it, daily, weekly. The time of doing it in production once a year is just gone. People realize it's not enough.
And it sounds like you scan every environment, right? I'm kind of a fan of that because, the whole like works on my machine kind of thing. And I think if you've got development, staging, and production, that even vulnerabilities can be different. And even though you think, well, it's the same code running, in development, staging, and in production at a certain point. But, in production has this vulnerability, but we didn't see that in staging because production's configured slightly differently. Maybe there's some redundancy and elastic and things like that, right? So it is important to scan all of your environments regularly.
It absolutely is. I think I'm forgetting which breach it was. Was it JP Morgan, where it was a application that was like signing up for some marathon or something, right? They were taking signups, and it was through that site that this company was breached. Do you remember which one I'm talking about?
I don't recall. So many breaches.
I know. So it was just like the example, though, is it's an application that no one thinks is important, right? And the security team may not even know that it's up there. Somebody just probably put it up there. It's a sign up, sign up here and join this marathon or race or whatever it was that they were. But somehow somebody was able to attack that and get in to the systems and, still a bunch of sensitive data. So you need to secure as many apps as you can.
Yeah, that's interesting. How do you balance the speed? Like when you have hundreds or thousands of applications and you want to run DAST against them, I think the first pushback you might come up against is, well, how do I scan those in a reasonable amount of time? How do you performance tune that?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So our scan times are kind of 2 to 4 hours, I would say, is the range. For full scans. But then we also do incremental scans, which are just a few minutes, right? You're looking at just what has changed. So I think that it's unrealistic to say that, you've got to wait 2-3 hours for if it's a full scan, to wait for it to finish, fix everything, and then release it, right? Because we get back to that whole concept of, developers under pressure to release quickly. So I think there's a balance. And there's a time where it's been prioritized, it's high severity, the application has access to sensitive data, and you've got to stop deployment and fix it. But when I think of speed, I don't just think of speed of the engine. I think of time that the vulnerability is left open is really important as well. So if you've got a fast DAS scanner, which is also accurate, and you've got all the workflows integrated, then even if you do release something in the wild, you're shrinking the time that it's actually exploitable, right? So even if you say that the scan takes 2 to 3 hours, it gets, and then the ticket goes to the developer, they say, this is what you've got to fix. Maybe it's out in the open for 6 hours, 12 hours, maybe even a day, right? But it no longer has to be the months or years that we've seen in the past. So I think, you can't sacrifice it. You can make the scan speed much less, but then you're sacrificing quality. So I think it's really a balance. But at the end of the day, I think the real goal, while we would love it to be no vulnerabilities in production, the reality is it's not going to happen, right? So let's try and minimize the vulnerabilities in production. And then for the vulnerabilities that are in production, let's try and minimize the time that they're exposed.
Yeah, it's an interesting balance, right? How quickly, so you've implemented DevOps in the CI/CD pipeline, you can push code out faster, but you can also introduce more vulnerabilities more quickly. But the other side of that is you can also fix them more quickly. And I agree with your assessment. It's about shrinking that window, right?
Right.
There's going to be vulnerable code in production, but you can fix it much more quickly than you could before. Right. It's definitely better than the waterfall model.
Yes. I don't know. Maybe life was easier for the developers. You tell me. Was life easier for you in the waterfall days?
For like a period of time, like it was a false perception. Like things would be great because you push that release and they found bugs and you're working on them, but production's happy until there's a breach or some catastrophic failure, right? I mean, a lot of these issues that we're fixing, yes, could be vulnerabilities, but could also impact reliability, performance, and uptime of the site.
True.
And so like you basically have a month where you think everything's great, and then one really bad day kind of erases that whole month that you spend in the waterfall cycle, right?
Yeah. I've never been a developer. And you certainly don't want me developing any of your code. But just my perspective is it's really tough because it's not just like vulnerabilities that you might lose some data. There might be political fallout or reputational fallout. This is the next. Forget nuclear weapons, right? It's cyber war now, right? This is the next wave of weapons. And we're putting developers out there to build stuff that we know is going to be insecure. And we know that the attackers are only getting more and more sophisticated because this is all they do all day long, right? So I feel like it's such an unfair match here where you've got developers who were asking to secure code, and then you've got the adversary, which is no longer just some guy in his basement. It could be the whole nation of China or Russia, right? It's such an imbalance today, and we've got to get the tools and the technologies right and implemented correctly if we're ever going to win this race.
Yeah, because it comes down to resources too, right? You talked about nation states that they're devoting their resources to finding and exploiting vulnerabilities. When you look at your dev teams today, their primary focus is functionality. And to go back and do security, you've got to spend some resources on that. And balancing that is very, very tricky. I know it's one thing I struggled with in our internal app was, I know we need to go to Python 3 because we're on Python 2, but that means we all have to take a time out, right? And focus on these things and not fixing bugs or implementing features. So, to your point, developers are already at a disadvantage. That's
right. Yeah. I was just talking to one of our customers today, and he was talking about this concept of tech debt. He's like, everyone thinks about tech debt as, all right, you've got a monolith, you need to move to microservices, right? Or you need to upgrade to the latest version of whatever. But he's like, I actually see security as tech debt. And that's why it's really important to continuously be scanning and fixing and taking that pause. And this particular customer that I'm thinking of his company has been breached in the past. And so I think that has changed the attitude, and he and the whole management team of this very large company is sort of understanding, all right, we need to think of security as important as, we need to think of it as ongoing tech debt that we have to figure out how to solve. And we've got to make sure that's just as important as constantly releasing new apps and innovating. Otherwise, we're going to be breached again. And sadly, it took a huge breach for that to happen. But they're sort of finally thinking along those lines. And I think that just a lot of companies aren't there yet.
Yeah, I really think that breaches really underscore the tech debt problem. And oftentimes, although it's sad that there was a breach, right? But breed that hygiene where you're not waiting around to go fix a bunch of security issues, that it's part of the process and you're finding and fixing things as you go. I find that to be, I often equate that to my home, where I've got to do proactive maintenance so that I can not have that disaster in the future. I think we need to look at software and how we secure our networks and systems in the same way, that keeping up with all of that hygiene, which is why I think it's important to, yes, give developers tools when they're developing code or designing to do it securely, but also find those at various stages and have that cycle where you are constantly fixing and doing things.
Yeah, it really is continuously scanning, continuously improving. And it's just like we do with the quality of the apps and the functionality we expect from the apps, right? We're continuously improving. Security just needs to be a part of that. It needs to be really embedded. If folks like me on the vendor side, if we're successful, like when I think about AppSec, right? If I'm successful, there should be no more DAS, SAST, IAST, SCA, RAST, whatever the new AST is, right? Forget that alphabet soup. We should be able to offer enterprises one platform that is so smart, right? Whether it's using machine learning or AI or whatever, they can understand what that app is. What is the intended functionality of it? What is the technology stack it's on? And when should it be scanned? Automatically trigger those and tell you what needs to be fixed when, right? And I think we as vendors are sort of making it even harder when we have all of these different technologies. So the developer has to learn how to use all of these, right? And we need to weave, if again, we're successful in security, which I hope we are, I hope there's no such thing as an AppSec security company, right? It should just be, it's part of all your development tools. That's the only way I feel like we're really going to be able to get ahead of this.
Yeah, and I feel, Sonali, I feel like accuracy is a huge part of that, because that means your developers are, regardless of priority and severity, are fixing actual problems. It may not be a problem today, but hey, maybe that library isn't even vulnerable today, but guess what? It's out of date. And if it's in your process to fix that, when that vulnerability comes out in that library, you've already updated it, or you've already know how to update it, and it's easier to go from version 1.2 to 1.3, not so much to go from version 0.7 all the way up, right? That's why I think hygiene, continuous scanning, and continuous development is so important.
Yeah. On that accuracy point, it's not only important for your internal development teams. One of our customers has been having this problem where they're scanning the third-party apps. They show them the proof, and they're like, "No, this is not ours. No, we didn't do this." And so that's an issue that we have with kind of when you're scanning third-party apps. And they found that the first few times the vendors were like, no, this is not ours. We didn't introduce this vulnerability. You show the proof. You show, here's the line of code. This is what you need to fix. Over time, they've been able to gain the trust. So it's not just gaining trust with your own security teams, but it's also gaining the trust of your partners in the supply chain, so that you don't end up with this finger pointing. You end up with, cooperation and working together to fix things.
Yeah, because I often feel like developers too, even, that's not my code, that's another library, or it's a Tomcat server that needs to be updated, and that's not I need to write new code. I don't need to spend time, upgrading a version, which could force you to update code as well. It's an interesting, kind of relationship when we look at all, like you said, the supply chain and all the components that make up your application, you may not write the code for all of them, right?
Yeah.
But you're still responsible for them.
Yeah. It's a tough job, but I think we're getting there. The industry's getting better. We're building better tools, and I do think that we just technology is changing so quickly, and the emphasis that I'm seeing in, I've been in cybersecurity now for years, and the emphasis that I'm seeing, from CEO boards putting on cybersecurity is starting to, make an impact. And I think it's got to come from, executive teams have to be focused on cybersecurity and seeing that as a real risk. And at the same time, the solution providers need to improve and provide tools that are accurate, fast, and automated within whatever else the developers are using. And then I think that's the only way we're really going to move forward.
So you're speaking at Black Hat on this topic. And so just tell me a little bit about your talk and what people can expect so they can go check it out.
Yeah, it's exactly about this. The title is, I think, The Great Overcorrection and Why You Need to Shift Left and Shift Right. And we sort of talk through, what are the reasons why shift left makes sense, but what is it that you're missing with the shift left, and what are sort of some best practices on how you can really protect your entire application service. So yes, would welcome your viewers. Please come watch the talk. If you're not able to do that, stop by our booth. We'd love to chat more, and I would love to just meet more and more people and understand their experiences so we can improve our products at Invicti. Fantastic.
Sonali, thank you so much.
Yeah, Paul, will you be there at Black Hat?
I will not. I will be attending virtually.
All right. Well, thank you for your time. Hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. For folks who want to learn more, you can visit securityweekly.com/NetSparker.